This week on A Lively Experiment, a high-ranking member of the McKee administration who resigned under pressure resurfaces with a lucrative contract to stay on as a consultant. And a bipartisan group says it's time to make some changes in Rhode Island's primary system.
A Lively Experiment is generously underwritten by...
Hi, I'm John Hazen-White Jr. For over 30 years, A Lively Experiment has provided insight and analysis of the political issues that face Rhode Islanders. I'm a proud supporter of this great program and Rhode Island PBS.
Joining us with the analysis, Boston Globe reporter Ed Fitzpatrick, Sue Cienki, chairwoman of the Rhode Island Republican Party, and political contributor Bob Walsh. Hello and welcome. I'm Jim Hummel. It is great to have you with us this week. Rhode Island's first housing czar resigned his post last month after increasing criticism from leading lawmakers and several disastrous media interviews. This week we found out that the McKee administration is keeping Josh Saal on as a $105 an hour consultant to his successor, Stefan Pryor, for the next several months. Ed, we've heard this music before when Dr. Alexander Scott left. I think those were a little bit different circumstances. We're in the middle of a pandemic. I think this has some people shaking their heads. Why the guy who resigned you would keep on?
Yeah, my colleague Alexa Gigas wrote about some of the missteps during the past year and some of the late reports not containing some key information on housing. And so it comes as somewhat of a surprise. And it comes at a time when, the headlines have been about the Cranston Street Armory and how that wasn't, that much money, $105 an hour, up to $27,000. That could certainly fix the windows over at the Cranston Street Armory. So, I think the administration is going to have to focus very quickly on what needs to happen next to address this housing crisis.
Stefan Pryor, Sue, was diplomatic. He said, well, it's kind of nice to do this, but just the optics, I think, for most people are not good.
The optics are terrible, and it's very different from Dr. Alexander Scott. I think, anybody that saw Dr. Scott, whether you agreed with what she did or not, she was present, and she was doing a job. Jonathan Saal, what did he do? I mean, the reports that he came out with, there was no substance to it. He didn't really look like he performed the job, and he was there for a year. And then we end up in a crisis. We have people sleeping underneath bridges in Woonsocket. We have people in Woonsocket that were moved out. So he actually didn't do his job. So we're paying for failure, and that's a terrible message to send to Rhode Islanders.
Robert?
My first reaction was to wince, as my colleagues on the panel have already articulated. But my second reaction is to be charitable. And we were starting to talk about this in the green room, but I saved it for the show. You bring someone in from out of state to do a high-level position that we haven't had before, and you don't give them a Sherpa to guide them through Rhode Island politics, are in trouble. I suspect that the reason that Josh Saal was hired is that he had a lot of policy chops in the area of housing. That does not always translate in the ability to become a czar, to be a leader, to know the leaders of our 39 cities and towns, our legislature, and everything else. And until you put the support system in place to allow someone like that to succeed, they're not going to succeed. And in fact, let's not sugarcoat it. He did not succeed in that position. That doesn't mean he didn't have something to offer, and if he's willing to stay for a short period of time to inform the new czar, Stefan Pryor, what he's seen and what he learned while he was there, I don't necessarily have a problem with that. I think if a year ago Stefan had taken this job, he might have hired Josh Saal as a policy assistant in that office, as a deputy czar or whatever. And I should also say, we got to get rid of the title czar. History shows us people titled czar, it does not work out well in the long term for them.
My point is, to Bob, is it's not really charitable. It's not charitable to keep somebody in a position that did not perform well. And it's not charitable to Stefan Pryor to have somebody that didn't perform well still remain and looking over his shoulders. Stefan Pryor's a smart gentleman. Let him figure out the housing problem. He's got the $250 million, to start. He'd like to have more. It's not charitable. Josh Saal, maybe he has another role in another area that he can be successful. I just don't think it's appropriate to keep somebody around that
this is going to be an office that's staffed with 35 to 40 people, and right now it's got Stefan Pryor. So they're going to have to staff up, and in the meantime, they're going to need some help. I'm not going out on a limb and defending this. I'm saying I understand the decision, and we'll see what it brings.
I agree with what you're saying about Saul coming in from the outside, and sometimes it takes you 6 months to figure out what the bathroom is at the State House. In this case, Stefan Pryor knows what he's doing. I don't think, regardless, I think he showed it during Commerce. So I'm not sure how much of a transition you need. All he has to do is talk to his boss, the governor. I just think the optics of having a guy who was considered a failure, now we're in effect. Now we're not only paying him, we're paying $5,500 in unused vacation time and health care for 3 months. I think the average Rhode Islander, that sounds like a little bit of a tin ear to me.
Well, if he was under contract, it would have cost more to buy out the contract, right? Maybe we're ahead of the game on this.
All right. So the man who is taking over as housing czar, the Housing Secretary for now, Stefan Pryor. I had a chance to catch up with him this week. This is his first week on the job. Of course, he's a known quantity, having been the head of Commerce. I met up with him at a job training site. Of course, we know that getting people to build houses is so key at this point. Here's a little bit of my conversation with him about what's going to happen with his job and affordable housing.
There are tremendous challenges in our housing market right now, up and down the price points in the housing market. People are not finding housing stock available that they can afford. So, Jim, we've got to improve that. We've got to improve that by doing more production. We have one of the, if not the lowest housing construction start rate in the country. So we've got to improve upon that. And there's several things involved with that. We've got to invest in affordable housing at lower price points. We've also got to work closely with towns to give them the tools and to loosen up some of the restrictions to enable more housing to get produced.
You're 4 days on the job, right?
Yes.
Where do you want to be in 6 months? Where do you want to be a year from now?
I'd like to make sure that we stand up a department for the first time in memory, if not in history, in Rhode Island. Let's have a housing department that is equal to the task. You're right, Jim, to say that $250 million is a lot of money, but it is not sufficient. We need additional steady public funding for the purpose. This is one of the highest priorities in Rhode Island. We need to apply resources to it. And we also have to make sure the private market feels confident to invest private money. So those are some of the things you'll see. We will also increase the intensity of our focus on the homeless community.
So, Sue, I think the battle that's going to be playing out in the legislature is the zoning regulations. Because, everybody says we need affordable housing. Is it going to be in my backyard? Are they going to use a vacant building? And there was some of that discussion last spring. I think that's where it's going to come down to.
Well, Jim, I think what the issue is, what exactly is affordable housing? I mean, the cost of living in Rhode Island is astronomical. You look at some of the new developments that are coming in. I don't know how anybody young starting out, even double income can afford some of these.
$400,000, right?
Can afford some of these houses. We were lucky enough to move to Rhode Island years and years ago. And could afford a house here. I'm not quite sure if a young couple now can afford to live here and stay here.
I think many of us say the same thing. I could not afford the house that I live in now in our neighborhood, probably all of us.
Yeah, and there's a more immediate crisis of the homeless. Providence College professor Eric Hirsch has said, the state needs to buy some hotels or some vacant buildings and immediately get people in them this winter. It's been a mild winter, but you've got people living outside. So, yeah, there's that immediate crisis. But to the point about the zoning laws, Jim, that's a great question because you see Senator Gordon Rogers is saying, Republican from Forster, saying, some rural communities don't have the capacity to handle that kind of density of new construction that some officials want to see in more outside the city centers. So
and
it's going to be a battle.
The money doesn't always solve the problem because you can buy things, but in terms of staffing, I mean, we're having a worker shortage all across the country. So staffing the armory, making sure you can't just buy these places and plop people down. You have to have wraparound services.
Yeah, services.
It's the iceberg problem. 10% of the problem is visible to the public, but 90% of it is kind of under the ocean, just churning along. The homeless problem became incredibly visible because of the tents of the State House when Senator Rogers and others start talking publicly about what they want and don't want in their own communities. It's visible. But the long-term sustainable issue is exactly what Sue talked about. They're just regular folks who cannot afford to not only buy a house, even afford an apartment to live here. We've got Massachusetts incomes coming into Rhode Island and buying housing in the north. We've got New York and Connecticut investors buying everything along the south coast and turning it into either student housing or Airbnbs. And we've got colleges that are still sending their students into adjacent markets and jacking up rental prices. So it's got to be a multifaceted solution. If you could wave the magic wand, all undergraduates in our colleges and universities would live on campus. That would free up an enormous amount of housing stock, but that's going to take a decade or more to operationalize, even if there's an agreement we should do it. That would take a lot of pressure off. The rental prices, but then you get the landlords resisting, saying, "Oh no, I bought this property so I can make a lot of money renting it out to kids," and that's just one piece of it. The homeless problem. Professor Hirsch is a terrific advocate, as is Reverend Dwayne Klinker on this. First rule is get everybody inside. We don't want anyone freezing to death. Then you've got to do the triage on the homeless community, the ones that are short-term because of an economic disaster, lost a job, or one paycheck away and the paycheck didn't come in, or one medical disaster away and want to get back on their feet. And then there are the underlying issues, including mental health issues in the community and substance abuse issues in the community that need to be addressed before people can get ready to get into sustainable housing. There's a lot on Secretary Pryor's plate.
Economics 101 would tell you the more inventory, then the prices would come down, but we're years away from that. I mean, $250 million sounds like a lot of money, but it's not, houses aren't popping up right and left.
Right. It's a long-term solution. And in terms of what Senator Rogers had said, there's no infrastructure in these rural places for people that are on the lower income scale they need transportation, they don't have cars, there's no RIP to buses going that way. So if they've got to get to work in the city, there's no way for them to get there. So he does have a very valid point. And to Bob's point, yeah, it's a multifaceted issue. You do have homeless, let's get them inside. Obviously, the Cranston Armory did not work out so well. There was no heating. There was broken windows. So there needs to be a place to get those people off the street. We do not have a big homeless problem like we do in Los Angeles and San Francisco. We have a smaller population all around. We should be able to fix this up. But as Bob said, there are lots of steps. Stefan, I wish him a lot of luck because he's got a big problem in front of him.
What about the choices, Stefan Pryor? Does it make sense to you?
It makes sense. I mean, he's familiar with state government. He's got a lot of administrative experience in Connecticut and New York, and he seemed to be one of the architects of the Rhode Island 2030 plan. He's got his mind around a lot of the policy levers he's going to have to push.
Can you quote a few pages from the 2030 plan? Do you have that in the back of your mind?
On page 79, Jim. I know.
He doesn't need a Sherpa. That's a big start, right? He already knows his way around the 39 cities and towns and state government and the legislature.
He's a known quantity, which helps a lot in Rhode Island. All right, the governor's budget is going to be the source of much discussion over the course of the next couple of months between now and June. The one thing that a lot of people are focusing on is this sales tax reduction proposed, very minimal at this point. What's interesting to me, Bob, is you've had, clearly the Republicans want more, but you've had a couple of House Democrats say that the 0.15 is not enough. I think it's going to be an uphill battle because it's not in the governor's budget now. But what about people who say, we've got a $600 million surplus, that's our money, what can you do more practically for me as a taxpayer?
Well, everyone can make a claim on the $600 million. Every retiree in the state and teacher who was in the system and state employees saying, wait a second, didn't Gina Raimondo take $2 billion away from us because there was never going to be a surplus? Aren't we supposed to get that money back? And I say that because I've heard it. So you can make a lot of different claims on the surplus. The Speaker of the House points out that if the surplus is there because we had underemployment and because we couldn't fill state positions, it's not a sustainable long-term surplus. So there's a lot of folks who can make claims on the money. Nonetheless, on the sales tax issue, I think first of all, everyone should remember that we don't do sales tax on food and in other areas. So our sales tax is high but narrow compared to some states. Nonetheless,
clothing and food.
Clothing and food is a big,
I was just going to go clothing.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, clothing and food.
Well,
it's a big deal.
It's a bit of a shock.
It's a
you
big
go to
deal.
other states.
Right.
There is
so,
like, wow.
if you said lower it but expand it, people say, oh no, don't do that. We like things the way they are. But I think the governor was very clever in putting a marker down down in the same way that it took us 6 or 7 years to get rid of the auto tax, said, hey, people have paid lip service to bringing down the sales tax every year. We're not sure what next year is going to look like. We have to wait for revenue estimating to come in. I'm going to put a marker down on this. I don't care if it's $77 or it turns out to be $39 for everybody in the first year. It's showing a directionality of where they want to take the state to be competitive in that area. So I thought it was a good idea. I don't think we're going to get the 5% or in a year because we just don't know. If we could afford it, we would.
Yeah, I think 0.1%,
1.5%. Don't short the governor.
Yeah, don't short the governor, right, is ridiculous. We have to be competitive with the other states. If we went to 6%, at least people from Connecticut and Massachusetts would cross the border and start spending money. 5% would be ideal if we get there. When you talk about the car tax, the only reason why we have the car tax reduction is Steve Frias was pushing Mattiello, and he wanted to get reelected. That's why we had it.
That's a big leap of
No, it's not a big leap of faith.
But Frias couldn't save the paw socks. That was a whole different. Go ahead.
No, so you have to push back. So I have to commend Senator Jessica Taylor Cruz that said, let's have a bold action. What people don't understand, if you have more people spending money in the state, then you will get more revenue.
But that's
it's not just
that's not happening overnight.
But you have the $600 million surplus now. As the cushion now, you will increase your revenue if people come to the state to buy.
God forbid they'd have to rewrite the budget, though, to include that, because they're putting some toward rainy day. They've got that money earmarked already.
Well,
they would have to blow it up.
I am sure that there are, as Bob said, 100 million people that are coming in saying, I want that money, the surplus money.
I think it's about $250 for every percent. $250 million will cost you 1%. So it would be almost $500 million.
We get about $1.5 billion on the
right.
Yeah, Governor McKee's proposal would take away that distinction of being tied for second for the highest in the nation. So it would eliminate that. But the other proposals, those critics say, it wouldn't change any behaviors. No one's going to come into Rhode Island and shop because it's 0.15. So, yeah, you've got Democratic legislators proposing going to 6. You've got Jessica Taylor Cruz, the Republican Senate Minority Leader, proposing 5. Bolder proposals, a lot more money, or a lot more revenue loss, but maybe those would be game changers.
How do you think this is going to play out in the session? Nice for discussion, but
it
not really going to get any traction.
It depends on May revenue estimating. We're talking about a way to give money back to people because we got a surplus. What if it goes up to $800 million?
The
surplus?
Yeah,
if it goes up to $800 million?
Yeah.
Oh, then we can do all sorts of things. I don't think that's going to happen.
You think
sadly, I don't think it's going to. Yeah,
I think the good thing is that we're talking about reducing it. That's always really a positive way to go.
Right, and that's what I was saying.
Trajectory.
I mean, the governor put a marker down. He said, this is a direction I want to take. He's there for 4 years, maybe 8, and gets that things can happen over time, and you've got to be cautious. The Fed didn't raise interest rates all at once to try and tame inflation. They do a little, see how it worked, check. Meet again, check, move forward, move the state forward. The 2030 plan, which has already been referenced, having an actual long-term vision of where we are now and where we want to take the state.
Please don't talk about the 2030 plan.
I remember when we used to talk about the 2020 vision. So a 2030 plan is refreshing.
Again, I think it's just we're moving in a positive direction. I think we've got to make bold steps. And I think that people do vote with their pocketbooks. People go across Massachusetts to buy gas because it's cheaper. So I think reduction in the sales tax will change behaviors here.
All right. A bipartisan group came out with a report this week suggesting that we change the way that primaries are held in Rhode Island. I know that's a long way off to the next primary. It's great that we have you as the party chair. I read that you were quoted on this. Now, it would change it. We have a closed primary system now. I saw it in some articles, Sue Cienki.
You were away.
I was away.
Maybe that was telepathic.
Jim.
Yeah, there you go. We have a closed primary system now. So
we have a semi-closed primary system.
So why don't you school us on it?
So what happens now is if a Democrat wants to come over and jump into the Republican primary, 30 days, they have to disaffiliate. And they can jump over.
For pure or illicit purposes, right?
Yes, for any illicit purposes. We already experimented with a completely open primary. In 1976, we had an open primary. And this is what happened. Phil Noel, who was then the governor of Rhode Island, was running in a primary against, I don't want to say...
Richard Lorber.
Yes, a car salesman, right? A car salesman.
Resident historian.
Right. He was running, and on the Republican side, we had John Chafee running for U.S. Senate. It was an open primary; anybody could jump in. Well, Republicans took that advantage. They jumped in, and Phil Noel lost that primary by 100 votes. So you can have a rating going on at any time. You know, if that had happened in this election, we could have sent Republicans over to the Democratic primary, and Seth Magaziner may not be the current sitting congressman. We could have said to the Republicans, go vote in the most liberal person because Rhode Islanders won't want that.
So do you want some type of change?
So do I want some? I'd like a close primary. I'd like the Republicans to vote for the Republicans, the Democrats to vote for the Democrats, you know.
So the other couple proposals are top 2 nonpartisan primary, top 4 with ranked choice, and then open primary altogether.
I could actually live with Sue's proposal of
Oh my
closed
goodness,
primaries.
we have bipartisan thoughts on this.
So we could form our own bipartisan group that says.
Why they didn't have us in the group?
You'll be the subcommittee.
That's why we're not in the group. But of the 3 proposals that this bipartisan group, friends of both of ours from way
Guy
back,
Dufault, Gary Sass, Tim
Bob
Duffy,
Flanders,
right.
all sorts of folks together. If you're going to do any of them, it's probably everybody's on the ballot in a primary, and the top 2 go to a general election. So at least what you're getting is the winner has over 50% of the vote. I understand why. And then you'd have to look backwards at time and say, well, how would that have worked? So I don't know if it would have been Dan McKee versus Ashley Kalis still, or if it would have been Dan McKee versus Helena Bonanno Folks.
Quickly,
That
before we
I
go to Ed.
absolutely
You don't like that?
disagree with
All
that.
right,
They
you're
call
on.
that a jungle primary.
Yeah, I
They
think
call it a
that's what they
jungle
call it,
primary.
yeah.
You know, they do it out in California. What would happen is, let's talk about the reality. You would get 2 Democrats involved. They would be 2 Democrats that are running in this state, and you would disenfranchise about 40% of the electorate that typically vote for Republicans. You have between 38 to 40%. So then what could happen? You could have 2 Democrats running. They would get 60% of the vote because the 40% are like, I'm not voting for either one of those Democrats. What would occur? We would start a write-in campaign. So then it would be a nightmare for the local board of canvassers to say, oh my God, we've got 40% of the vote that are now, it's a write-in campaign for
I don't know
a
if
candidate.
you could do write-in in that model.
You
And I
could
really
do.
don't.
Yeah, you
I
could.
don't know if they allow it.
Under current circumstances, you could do. So you'd have the 2 Democrats get 30 and 30%, and in reality, this could happen. You'd get 40% for a write-in candidate.
Yeah, but why
And it
wouldn't
would
in
take
that
votes.
scenario, if a lot more people vote, and I'm kind of agnostic about this thing, why wouldn't the Republican have the advantage in, well, let's pretend Alan Fung was on the ballot against all those Democrats. Alan certainly would have made the finals. I don't know which Democrat would have
maybe not.
made the
Did you know that it was called the jungle primary? That was new to me.
Yeah,
I
I've
haven't
heard
heard that
jungle.
before.
I think a lot of this is driven by the fact that the governor won with less than a majority, Mayor Smiley won with less than a majority in the primary. So there's been proposals from Representative Kislak and Senator Zuri, I think, for ranked choice.
That's awful.
So that's one piece of
That's
legislation
because
that's
you
going to be
find out
there.
like in December and you got to run it 10
Well,
times.
that
right?
presumes that the differentiation in rank is equal.
But until
there are
Jim-
folks who would never want Sue and folks who would never want me. And if they both vote for Ed, they're like, I don't like either of these other 2. I only want Ed to be the.
Well,
That's good for Ed.
Ranked
good for
choice
me.
is too complicated. It's way too complicated. You would have to change all the machines in Rhode Island. To educate people, you'd have to spend an enormous amount of time, and it can be so manipulated. Just as you said, if they didn't like you, but they liked me, but they knew that you were my toughest competition, they would mark me 1, they would mark him 2, and they would mark you 3. It would be, you would manipulate
You've
the
given
elections.
this a lot of thought, haven't
I
you?
have. Yes,
Sue
because
sits
I've
up
been
at
involved-
night going, Ed, Bob.
Well, you see the flaws. I'll tell you one thing that
Well, because-
benefits my team if you had the top 2 in a runoff. There's always a mayor's race in Providence in the general. Bigger Democratic turnout. Alan Fung would have lost by more votes. If all things being equal, if more Democrats voted in Providence in the general election, because there was no mayor's race, that would have helped the Democrat against the
If wagering was allowed at Twin River on this issue, I would bet.
It's not?
I would bet that's going to stay the way it is because the people who are in office right now were elected under the current system. I think it's going to stick this way.
Well, and
You
you'll
might
have
get
all
the top 2.
And I think when we talk about this too, and you had mentioned it early, you talk about the primaries. necessary because any of these changes, you'd have to change the Rhode Island Constitution. In 1894, it said the plurality.
Plurality,
Yes,
yep.
thank you.
First past the post.
Yes, first past the post wins. So you'd have to have a constitutional
Can you say
convention.
that 4
and
times quickly?
No, I
First
can't.
past the post?
All
right, to be continued.
Stop
I'm
with
glad
the
we had you
chicanery.
on, though, because you've given this a lot more thought than I have.
This is a big deal because
Yeah, it is
you'd
a big
also have
deal.
to talk about moving the primary earlier, which we're going to have to do anyway.
Well, and I think we have to discuss that. I mean, you talk about election law changes and you talk about early voting, and we've moved it to 20 days. I'm not sure that we need the 20 days. I don't object to early voting at all, but 20 days is too long when our primary is so late.
Right, we're going to have to move it.
We're going to have to move
To
it.
be continued. Let's go to
gonna form our own group.
outrages and/or kudos, and you can have your own side group after this. Ed, what do you have today?
My outrage is about I'm a runner, and on Wednesday nights I run with this group, and one of the better members of it was Pierre Lipton, and he just died after finishing a marathon in Arizona. He was just 26 years old. He finished the marathon at 3:10. He was super fast. He was in 26 years did a ton. He was named to the Forbes 30 Under 30. He started a company called 1440 that was a source for unbiased news. Millions of people subscribe to this. So, I'm just outraged that he's gone so soon.
Yeah. So what do you have?
So I'm going to stick with the election. I'm going to stick with the legislation that got put in that wants to allow illegals to vote in municipal elections. I think the U.S. Constitution is pretty solid on that. You have to be a citizen to be able to vote. So I think that is just a
Well,
complete
then that's
waste
not going
of
to
time.
make it through the. I mean, it's an interesting thing to talk about.
Yeah, but it's just, it would be ripe for a court challenge. So I just think stop
They do
wasting
that
our
in
time.
any other states?
Well, actually, they tried it in New York. They wanted the 800,000 non-citizens to vote in municipal elections, and the Republicans actually brought a court case against that, and it was shot down. Up in Vermont, there's a current court case now about that.
California to it.
Yeah, in California. So they're, everybody tries to push the thing.
The envelope.
Push the envelope.
You get the last minute, Mr. Walsh.
Not an outrage as much as an observation. There was an article, front page in the Journal, about how hard it is to find a primary care physician. I have seen that. I've been lucky enough not to personally experience it, although I've lost 2 primary care physicians who moved out of state for a better deal. We need, as a state, to focus on that issue. It's harder and harder for primary care physicians to practice in the state. They have a boatload of debt coming out of college. The paperwork, now technology-based paperwork, demands on them a greater and greater.
It's insurance reimbursements too, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And, low Medicaid reimbursements, lower overall general insurance reimbursements than our adjoining states. We need a concerted effort to do the entire range of activities needed to bring more primary care physicians into Rhode Island. If you're going to use primary care physicians as the gatekeeper for all other health services, you need to have as many as you need to service our population.
All right, folks, we are not done yet. I'm making the call right now. We have got some national issues to talk about, so let's do a Lively Extra. If you can join us now, go to ripbs.org/lively. For the rest of you, we will bid you adieu. Ed and Bob and Sue, nice to see you again. Hope you can stick with us for the online Extra, but if you can't, come back next week as the Lively Experiment continues.
A Lively Experiment is generously underwritten by
Hi, I'm John Hazen White Jr. For over 30 years, A Lively Experiment has provided insight and analysis of the political issues that face Rhode Islanders. I'm a proud supporter of this great program and Rhode Island PBS.